In 1925, a deadly infection spread through a small town in Alaska. Doctors had invented a life-saving serum, but there was just one problem. The serum was miles away, and the small town, called Nome, was surrounded by ice and blizzards. How on earth would the people of Nome get the serum in time? The answer was an ancient native tradition, dog sledding. For hundreds of years, the indigenous people of Alaska had been training dogs to pull sleds. And in Nome, dog sledding became the best way to transport goods and people over the thick snow. It would take a heroic act of teamwork to get the serum to Nome. 20 native and European sled drivers and over 100 dogs would cross hundreds of miles to collect the life-saving serum. The Norwegian immigrant Leonard Seppala was one of these drivers. His team of dogs, led by Togo, would travel the farthest, over icy ground, through dangerous storms, and over frozen lakes. It is an incredible adventure that has become a part of American history. Perhaps you have heard the name Balto. Well, this is where it all started. This is the story of the Nome Serum Run, the race against death.
Hi, young historians. Welcome to another episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History. Do you love true stories where animals saved the day? The people in the story you are about to hear were pretty amazing. But the stars are really the dogs. In this episode, we get to learn about the incredible people who risked their lives and the lives of their sled dogs to save countless people in remote Alaska. So, grab a cup of hot cocoa because this story is about to get a bit chilly.
Our story begins in January 1925. Leonard Seppala walked outside his cabin in Nome, Alaska. He could hear joyful yelps and howls in the distance. Seppala tramped through the snow towards the kennels and soon saw the dogs. One of them, named Togo, ran up to him and raised his paw in the air. This was something Togo often did when he was asking for a favor. This time, Togo wanted a good pet. Seppala rubbed Togo's fur and smiled at this mischievous little dog. Born in Norway, Seppala had traveled to Alaska many years ago to find gold. But instead of gold, he found a love for the dogs he met along the way. Learning from the indigenous people of Alaska, Seppala began a career racing dog sleds. Now he was known as one of the best sled drivers in Alaska. The rest of the dogs stared up at Seppala and wagged their tails, but they may have been able to sense that something was wrong. Seppala's heart was heavy that day. He had just heard terrible news. A deadly illness was spreading through the town. Many people had been sick lately, including Seppala's daughter. At first, the doctor thought it was nothing to worry about, just a sore throat. But a child had just died. And now it was clear. This wasn't just a sore throat. It was a deadly infection called diphtheria. It wouldn't be long before many more became ill. And to make matters worse, the doctor didn't have the medicine he needed. He had ordered medicine, called an antitoxin serum, one summer ago, but it hadn't arrived. Nome was a remote little town near the Russian border, and it was the middle of winter. Thick ice and whipping winds surrounded the small little town. Sick people were lining up outside the doctor's office looking for help. How on earth was Nome going to get the serum in time? Something had to be done, and quickly. As Seppala stood outside his cabin with his dogs, the Alaskan government was already busy at work. They needed to figure out a way to transport the serum all the way to Nome. They realized they could get the serum as far as Nenana, the town closest to Nome, but it was still over 600 miles away. Planes were out of the question. At that time, planes still had open cockpits, so the blizzard winds would freeze the pilots. Trains were not possible. There was no railroad to Nome. And a boat? The port was frozen over. There was only one way. The governor of Alaska received an urgent message. The message said,
"Have you any funds to pay for relaying dog teams from Nanana to Nome? Answer quick."
At that moment, it was decided. The serum would travel to Nome not by plane, train, or boat, but by dog sled. The government gathered volunteers. Together, 20 different drivers and over 100 dogs would work together to bring the medicine to Nome. Each driver would carry the serum part of the way and pass it on to the next. And there was one man they trusted to cover the longest and most dangerous leg of the journey, Leonard Seppala. Seppala was back inside his home in Nome. There was a knock on his door. Seppala opened the door to his cabin and said hello to the man standing outside. The man introduced himself as the chairman of the Board of Health. He had an important question to ask Seppala.
"Would you go out over the trail and bring back the diphtheria serum?"
The chairman asked.
"I should be glad to go if the authorities felt there was no better team,"
Seppala answered.
"You must be ready at a moment's notice,"
the chairman said. Seppala began training the dogs, waiting for the moment his team was needed. Every time the telephone rang, the dogs howled in excitement. Was it time to go yet? Finally, one morning, the telephone began ringing loudly. The dogs were already howling by the time Seppala answered. It was time. Seppala quickly dressed in his sledding gear and walked towards the kennels. The dogs spotted Seppala's clothes and knew exactly what was happening. They began jumping and running with excitement. Seppala looked at the brave Siberian Huskies in front of him. Who would he choose to lead the pack on this dangerous mission? First, he looked at Balto. He was a large dog with black fur and white paws, and the favorite of Seppala's assistant. But Balto was a bit of a risk. You see, he had never led a racing team before. Would he be ready for such an important journey? Seppala decided to leave him behind. Then there was Fritz. He had cream-colored fur with brown and gray markings.
"He is a great dog,"
Seppala said. Fritz often co-led Seppala's team, running alongside his brother Togo. Now, Togo was the trusted leader. Ice blue eyes and dark brown fur with black and gray markings.
"I never had a better dog than Togo,"
Seppala said. Now, if Seppala was honest, Togo hadn't always been his favorite. As a puppy, Togo had been quite small and often sick. Seppala thought he would never be fit to drive a sled. So when Togo was 6 months old, Seppala gave him away to a friend where Togo would live an easier life indoors. But Togo was a mischievous little pup who did not want to be trapped inside a house. He jumped through the window of his new home and ran back to Seppala. This great escape made quite an impression. Maybe Togo was strong enough for sledding after all.
Hi, young historians! Time for a quick break from this amazing story to tell you a bit more about Honest History. If you're enjoying this episode, then you'll love Honest History's magazines and books. Each one is filled with important adventures through the past, like the story of Cheng Yi Sao, a Chinese woman who commanded one of the largest pirate fleets in history, to Mansa Musa from Africa, one of the wealthiest people to ever live. You can pick up a copy or subscribe and receive 3 issues delivered straight to your doorstep every 3 months. Just go to honesthistory.co and use code ANYTIMENOW for a 10% discount. That's honesthistory.co and special promo code ANYTIMENOW. Okay, let's get back to the story.
Fast forward 11 years, and Togo was the leader of the pack and Seppala's favorite. He may be small, but Togo made up for it in courage and determination. Seppala quickly picked Togo and Fritz to lead the way. Then he carefully picked 18 more dogs to join his team. He packed his sled and got the dogs into their harnesses. The people of Nome gathered around them to wish them luck. It was time to go.
Mush!
Sapala shouted. With that, the dogs were off like lightning. The first day, the team covered over 30 miles, and after that, the dogs ran about 50 miles a day. So far, the weather had been good. Then, on the fourth day, the team arrived at Norton Bay. Sapala looked out at the frozen water. He could go around it, but that would add an extra day, and they didn't have the time. Many years ago, Sapala had tried to cross this frozen water with Togo and nearly died. The ice had cracked and left them floating away from land. What if the ice cracked again? What if they fell into the freezing water? He looked over at Togo. It was a risk, but he trusted Togo to lead the way.
Mush!
Sapala shouted, and the dogs began crossing over the frozen water. The wind blew at their backs and pushed them forward until they made it across. It was almost time for a rest, but Sapala and the dogs spotted another team in the distance. They raced forward. The wind blew loudly as Sapala's sled passed the other team. The driver on the other sled waved and yelled.
Serum! Turn back!
He said. Sapala shouted to Togo.
Gee!
He wanted Togo to turn around, but it was going to take a while for all the dogs to slow down. Finally, the sled came to a stop and Sapala turned back to meet the other dog sled. The sled driver was relieved to see Sapala.
The epidemic has increased since you left,
he began to explain. The other teams had begun traveling day and night to get the serum closer to Sapala. The driver tossed a package onto Sapala's sled. It was the serum. Sapala and his dogs didn't need to go any further. It was time to turn back, to go home to Nome. Now, with the wind against them, they had to cross back over the Norton Sound, back over the frozen water. The freezing wind blew against their faces and they marched forward in the dark for 43 miles. Finally, they made it. They could rest. The Inuit and Yupik, the indigenous people of that land, gave Sapala an igloo to rest inside. The dogs were fed salmon and seal blubber. After resting, Sapala and the dogs were ready to start again. An indigenous older man looked out across the ground and told Sapala to be careful. Using his knowledge of the land, he advised Sapala to take a different route. It would be better to travel closer to the shore in case the ice broke. Sapala followed his advice that likely saved his life. As the team ran near the shore, they came close to open water. The route Sapala had used only hours before no longer existed. That ice had broken off and was now floating in the sea. Sapala and the dogs reached the next village, where there was another team. The driver's name was Charlie Olson. Sapala handed over the package and the instructions and watched as Charlie and his team of dogs began their journey towards Nome. Charlie Olson delivered the serum to another driver, Gunnar Kaasen. Kaasen had chosen Balto to be on his team. This was the dog, if you remember, that Sapala had left behind. Together, Kaasen and his dogs began the last few miles towards Nome. A terrible storm blew in during the last 28 miles. Kaasen could barely see the dogs running in front of him. When he arrived at the next stop, he saw the roadhouse where the last driver was waiting, but there was no light on in the house. Was the last driver asleep? Kaasen didn't stop and took the serum all the way to Nome himself. Finally, on February 2nd, around 5:30 in the morning, Kaasen and his team reached Nome. The doctors unpacked the serum and began giving it out immediately. Kaasen stepped off his sled and walked over to Balto.
He's a fine dog,
he said. Balto had helped pull the sled through the terrible storm. Sapala arrived in Nome later and was surprised by what he saw. Journalists and camera crews were all gathered around. All of this time, newspapers had been printing stories about their race to Nome. Cameramen were taking photos of Kaasen and, much to Sapala's shock, Balto. Balto's journey to Nome became the headlines of newspapers across the United States.
Balto crosses the finish line,
journalists announced. To this day, it is unclear if Balto had been leading the sled during those last few miles. Sapala looked at Togo and sighed. He thought if anyone should be famous, it should be Togo. He had traveled twice as far as anyone else over the most dangerous route.
The Serum Drive was Togo's last long run. In that drive, he had worked his hardest and best,
Sapala said. Much to Sapala's annoyance, Balto, rather than Togo, would get a statue in Central Park, New York. In the end, Togo didn't get the fame, but perhaps that was for the best. Togo got to spend his last years peacefully laying next to a warm fire in Maine. He lived until the old age of 16. Something the newspaper got wrong in 1925, and for many years to come. The race to Nome wasn't about one dog and one man. It was about a team that involved 20 drivers, 150 dogs, and many Native Alaskans who helped every step of the way. Its success depended on indigenous knowledge and skills. Together, the sled drivers and dogs risked their lives to deliver the life-saving serum. And because of that, the Great Race to Nome became an unforgettable moment in history.
Welcome back. Many of us grew up thinking that Balto was the dog who saved the day during the Nome Serum Run, and were happily corrected later in life to learn the true story. That's the wonderful thing about history. We are always learning new information that shifts our perspective on the stories we grew up believing as true. That's why it's important to always stay curious and never be afraid to ask questions or desire to learn more. That's all for now, but if you like hearing stories about the cold, be sure to check out issue 14, A Russian Winter. You can learn all about Siberia, Russian winters, and the indigenous people of Russia. See you all next time. This episode was hosted by Becky Braunstein and written by Heidi Coburn. Production was led by Randall Lawrence. To learn more about this episode, including more about the host, visit us at honesthistory.co and follow along for updates on social media at Honest History.
When you think about history, are there lots of old guys wearing wigs and stockings? When you think about history, is Napoleon really short? And folks have wooden teeth. Do you know that history can be the most incredible, amazing stories for you and me? Sit back and listen to a story right now. It's honest, it's fun, and it's sure to